Hey, it's Holly. In today's video, I'm going to show you the full process of how I created this custom McDonaldland Polly Pocket. This was such a fun project to do. It was a lot of work and it was a lot of learning curve to do all of the steps. Specifically, of course, making the custom resin figures was probably the most difficult part. But I'm going to show you the whole thing from start to finish. I've been working on this over the course of a few months, so bear with me as I piece all of this footage together. But here's how I made my custom McDonaldland Polly Pocket. What I learned from my first mold making process was that when I was making a mold, it needed to have lots of vents. So you can see I put my figures into the mold with lots of little pieces of toothpick to make a ton of vents. So that was to reduce the chance of bubbles. At which point I used the same silicone I'd been using the whole time I was making figures, and this took about half an hour to cure. At which point I then had this. So this is the plastiline clay, and I was able to demold it, and ultimately this is what I was left with. So the figures were embedded in the silicone with the vents, and then from here I was able to mold the other side. So I put it back into the mold, and once I had it in the mold, then I re-poured silicone on top. So what you're looking at here is now me taking the full complete mold out of the casing. I had a little box that I had put together there to create the mold, and those little dots on top are all the vents that I had created. And then this is just a picture of all of the chaos. So when I was making it, I was using at this point resin to get the figures to be really solid. I basically poured resin into the mold through the little vents, and then I held it together with a ton of elastics. I had to tumble and shake that mold around a whole bunch to get out as many bubbles as possible, and that was just part of the learning process. Fortunately, it did work for the most part. It's not foolproof, and because I'm not using a vacuum chamber or heat and that kind of stuff, it's not going to be perfect every time, but it was good enough, and I was able to get some really solid figures out of it. So here are some of the figures that I was able to get. These are some examples of the pieces that were coming out of the mold. So not all of them were perfect, but I did just a few castings and I was able to get some solid ones. So this is just me showing off some of the good ones that I made. As you can see, I always drop figures, whether I'm doing a toy tour or just showing you the stuff I make. But I was able to get some really solid figures out of this. So those little black marks that you see is just leftover plastiline clay that was picked up by the resin from the mold, which isn't a huge deal because of course I'm painting over these, so I wasn't fussed about that. But I'm just showing you how well these turned out. I was so happy and shocked, but they turned out really, really well. So that midge is the midge that you now know as the Ronald McDonald figure, but I was super pleased to actually get some really solid castings for once. So all in all, that was a success, and I was super happy to move forward at this point. And then I had to decide, okay, who's going to be who? So I went through and looked at the figures and made a list. I was stuck on what the figures should be, like which figures from the McDonaldland series I wanted, but also who should be who. And I just felt like Midge naturally lended herself to Ronald McDonald, but also Polly, I wanted to be a really recognizable character just because Polly is typically the star of the show. So that's why I went with Hamburglar for Polly. Birdie I wanted to incorporate, and I felt like the pigtails really lended themselves to the aviator goggles that Birdie wears. So that's why I went with Tina for Birdie. Officer Big Mac, I used Titch just because Officer Big Mac wears a hat, so I thought Titch would be perfect for that. And then Grimace, I just felt like I had to include Grimace because Grimace was a total favorite of the McDonaldland series, but very difficult to translate. So I went with Lulu just because she's quite streamlined. So I felt like I could, for lack of a better term here, get that kind of blobby effect just from having a very smooth figure. So that's why I chose Lulu for Grimace. So I had already painted Midge up as Ronald as a proof of concept, and at which point then I was able to move forward and paint the rest. So what you're looking at here is the rest of them once I had them painted. Of course, they don't have their face yet. We're going to get to that later, but that was the initial paint. So I knew I was going to spray paint this yellow and try to do a McDonald's theme on the outside. So therefore, I wanted to wipe the original logo completely off, which kind of hurts your heart to do in the moment, but it wasn't perfect to begin with, so I didn't have a huge issue with that. So I just used rubbing alcohol to clean that off. You don't want to use acetone when you're doing that because it can melt the plastic. So rubbing alcohol, I got that super, super clean. At this point, I wanted to be sure that I was ready to put a logo back onto it properly once I had it spray painted. So I just wanted to do a test to make sure I had my technique down before I went ahead and spray painted it, just so that I wasn't making errors down the road later. So that's what you're seeing here is I started foil, and then here is my end result. So I was happy with this, at which point I then decided, okay, I can move forward and I'm going to wipe it back off and we're going to move on to the spray painting phase. Now, in order for me to spray paint it, I wanted to make sure that I could spray paint both sides, and therefore I needed to ensure that I had completely masked off the inside of the compact. And this is because I was going to preserve the stickers, so you don't just want to go at it with spray paint and then have the stickers be ruined. So I took a few passes at this, but basically got some plastic wrap. I wrapped the interior, taped it in, covered it in more tape. I wanted to make sure that this was super sealed before I broke out the spray paint. Now I apologize. I realized I did not take a picture of this. The paint I used is, if you are in North America at least, Rust-Oleum Painter's Touch 2x Ultra Cover Multi-Purpose Paint and Primer in Gloss Sun Yellow. This was a spray paint and I got it from Home Depot. So I just wanted something that was paint and primer but also had a built-in gloss, just so that I was partially already on my way to the finish that I wanted. This definitely took a few coats, and you want to do really thin, even coats as best you can. But once I had a solid coat on it, I was ready to move forward and do the gold foiling of the logo. So here I'm using my Clover mini iron 2. It's a quilting iron meant for small sort of sewing and quilting projects. I find it works great for foiling. And the hot foil that I'm using, I got off of eBay. So it's just a gold hot foil. I have a full foiling video if you're curious. But I am using my mini iron on the medium setting. I found that that worked really well. And I decided that I was going to start with the outside and just work my way slowly around the edge. This I found was the trick to getting a nice smooth logo. And by using the medium setting on this iron, it's not a perfect science, but from some tests, I can tell you that the hot setting was way too hot. It just immediately disintegrated the foil, and the low setting just wasn't very effective. So the medium setting was good, but also not hot enough that it was going to melt the logo down with too much ease. So I found that this was the perfect medium, no pun intended, but it was great. So I just took a lot of time and care to get this logo on. And ultimately I had been sitting and thinking about it. You know, do I want it gold? Is gold the right choice here? I felt like it wasn't McDonald'sy enough. So that's why I went through and made a choice to change the color of the logo later. If you've already seen the end result, then you know what I'm talking about. But this is a process. And the problem is that I'm not super patient, so I do make some mistakes here, but you'll see that in a moment. So as to not be totally boring, this is the end of the foiling process, but you can see I got some gold on the compact, which was not ideal. So this is just because I was impatient and I wasn't being particularly super careful, but that's okay. So once I was happy with the logo, at this point, I can just use some rubbing alcohol to clean this up. So that's exactly what I'm doing here, is I'm just using some cotton swabs and a fair amount of pressure, and I'm just wiping that off. So this took a little time to fix. Probably would have taken less time if I was just more careful, but again, this is just how I roll. But the good news is that it does come off with rubbing alcohol and some pressure, and it doesn't really damage the paint. Plus, I am going to be putting a enamel coat on this later, so I wasn't hyper concerned about that. But it did come off fairly easily, and at which point, once I had it all cleaned up and ready to go, I just took some time to make sure that everything was looking smooth before I move forward. So I'm just using here in a moment an alcohol wipe just to sort of clear that surface back to where it was, just because I like everything to be just as so. So that's what the process was here. At this point, I went ahead and dug out my paint. So I'm using Tamiya brand acrylic paints, and I wanted to change the logo. Specifically, I wanted the logo to be a red shiny logo. So I realized, oh, hey, I actually have a clear red paint, which was really helpful. That it was clear, because then I can still get that shine through the logo. So I took the clear red paint and a paintbrush, and I went ahead and I fixed that logo up. So here's the thing, I'm not super patient, as I mentioned before. So I had a bit of a hard time with this, and I'm not an artist by any means. So for me, painting this super accurately was difficult. Like, I don't really paint anything else at all. So I bought these paints purely just for doing Polly Pocket restoration stuff. So I was trying to be careful, but I did make some mistakes, of course, as I do. I do stuff like this. I am very much a make a bunch of mistakes to learn type person, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, but it's a process. So for me, I just did the best that I could with the patience that I have, the small amount of patience. So as a result, I did need to come in and clean this up after. So I just use here an alcohol wipe, and then inside the logo, I used one of my pointy cotton swabs and just cleaned up inside. And the good news is that because the spray paint was quite good, the finish was nice, I was able to wipe this off without it causing staining or damaging to the spray paint. So this looked pretty great, and I was really, really happy with it. So it's not too difficult a process. You just ideally should have some patience when you're working with this. So ultimately that got cleaned up. I just went and made sure that I was super happy with it, which every time I looked at it, I could find something. But at this point, I was finally happy with it, and you can see it came out great. So really, really happy with the finish on that. and at this point I was ready to move forward. So I just went ahead and added an enamel coat. So this is just a craft enamel that I bought at, I don't know, somewhere like Michael's. I've had this for a long time. But my goal with this was just to give it a nice gloss finish, seal in that paint that I had just put on so that it didn't run later or smear. So I did a gloss coat, and that is ultimately how I got the finish that I achieved at the end. So that was the step for sealing the outside. And then I needed to move on to the inside and finishing the figures. So my figures, as you saw earlier, they did not have faces on them. And if you've seen some of my videos in the past, I got these really cool faceplate stamps from another Polly Pocket collector. She had these laser graved faceplate things made up. You'll see them in a moment. But this is when I needed to then go ahead and add them. So I got all of my figures out. Excuse the fact that I just like totally have my phone there. But my goal was to now go through and stamp the faces on. I also have a full video on this. If you have not seen me do this before, definitely go check it out. But effectively, I'm using a UV stamping gel. This is meant for nail art. These plates are fantastic. And again, I got these from another collector. But I am just adding the gel to this faceplate that has little engraved pictures of all the different Polly Pocket faces possible. I am then scraping the excess gel off. And once I have this all cleaned up, I then just go in with a clean piece of paper towel, wipe off any excess. And now that that is all cleaned up, there we go. I'm then picking it up with the little stamper. And I just have to make sure it's super clean first. So I'm cleaning it off with tape just to make sure there's no lint on it. So this is just a little jelly thing that you pick up the nail art stamp with. In this case, I'm picking up that face. And I then take that and I stamp it directly onto her face. So this is Grimace that I'm doing. It sometimes takes me a few tries, and by a few tries, I might mean 10 or 15 tries to get this. But this one was a good attempt. So we got her face on there. And ultimately, then I just cure that inside of a UV lamp. So with her down, I then moved on to the next figure. Now, to not be totally boring, I am just working on Polly in this one. So I've got the stamp going on currently. I'm just slightly off camera with that because I'm holding it really close to my face to make sure that it is super accurate. But once I get that stamp on, Polly looked amazing. As you can see, I am being very, very careful with it. But I then just moved on and continued the rest of my figures. And this is them curing under a UV light. So they just need to cure for about 2 minutes and then they are permanent. At this point, I needed to prime the interior of the compact. So this is the surface primer from Tamiya that I used. And just so you have a reference, this is what the interior of the compact looked like before. So from here, we're going to get painting. Okay, so at this point I have it all primed. That's the white that you see there. I'm now going in and I started with the bottom. So first I am painting a base layer for the, booths. The tables, basically, the booths in the bottom. And I was just trying to decide what kind of shade of brown I was going to go with. So ultimately I do change this up a bit. But I went in and I got a base color in, and that primer just really helps make sure that you don't get bleed through of the previous color. It also helps the paint stick a bit better. So that's why I had primed the whole thing. You'll see that I left the stickers as is, and that's because I wanted to keep the stickers. I did make a few changes down the road, but I made sure that I did not prime or paint onto the stickers for the most part. So once I got that on there, you can see I had mixed up a bunch of different colors, and those colors were just the palette that I had decided on. So if you saw the video where I did the full tour of this compact, effectively I was aiming for the palette of a 1980s, 1990s McDonald's, which had a lot of those teal, maroon, pink, this like kind of barfy dentist office pink elements in it. And that's not necessarily what we always think of when we think of McDonald's these days, but at the time that's how most of them were decorated. So my reference photo was actually this time capsule McDonald's that currently still exists in Oregon. I believe they use it mostly for the film industry, but that is what I was going for. Because McDonaldland was the inspiration for this, and McDonaldland existed back when restaurants looked like this, the McDonald's restaurants. So that's why I made that choice. So it took a few passes for me to kind of get this brown the color that I wanted it to, but I carried that throughout. Now, I didn't film the entire painting because this is sped up 8 times, if you'll believe it. And even then, this took me probably about 3 hours to paint from start to finish, just because I was being super careful with it and still making decisions at the same time. So this was an intense process, and it took quite a while for me to actually get it painted. But you can see that I used a few different shades of brown that I mixed up. And the challenge with mixing these acrylic paints is they dry really fast. So you kind of have to work quickly, and also then sometimes go back and remix and color match. It just is what it is. So that was part of the challenge, but it did fortunately ultimately work out. So you can see that I'm now at this point changing my mind about the color that I wanted the boots to be, because I felt like it was maybe a little bit too dark, so I lightened those up quite a bit, and that ultimately worked out okay. So I was happy that I made that change. It really did look quite a bit better in my opinion. So once I got all of that switched over, then I decided to start working on some of the interior. And this is where I am then going to start switching into the teal, the pink colors to get this all up. Now, bear with me because I know a lot of this is off camera, but I was trying to be very detailed and focused. So for the sake of me not messing it up, I pulled it in really close to myself. So apologies, but that's why a lot of it is off camera here. So effectively, this went on for hours is what I'm trying to say. I took a long time to get this painted up so that I was happy with it. And then ultimately here, this was the finished look. So lots of work, but I got that all painted up. Of course, you can see that in the full toy tour, but just to give you that clip of what the finished product looked like again, this was the full painted and put together compact. So I was so happy with this. It's not perfect, and again, I'm not an artist by any means, but it was a really fun project to do. And because Polly Pockets are all about nostalgia for me, being able to bring in that other nostalgic element of my childhood, those McDonaldland characters, was really fun. And being able to relive what those restaurants used to look like. So ultimately, I was just very happy with how this turned out. I did add some elements here with the McDonald's food items, making sure I captured those stripes on the benches, and all of that stuff throughout. I have that little Ronald McBear, I like to call him. That's not an official thing, but there was a teddy bear, so I just kind of painted him Ronald McDonald style. But I'm really pleased with how this turned out, especially considering that I have never done anything like this before. So that was the process. It was wild from start to finish, but I'm very happy with it. And aside from the compact, it was so fun making these figures. I'm just proud that I was able to make functional figures out of resin from scratch. I think that is just so cool, that that's possible. But then also being able to paint these up like McDonaldland characters. I had so much fun doing this. So if you're still watching this, 24 minutes later, thank you. But this project was really fun, and I hope you enjoyed following along the process. Again, I've got full videos on all of the other elements, the creating the resin figures, all of the trials and tribulations of that, the foiling, the face stamping. Check those out. All right, so that was a huge process. It was a lot of work, but a labor of love. I really wanted to try my hand at doing a repaint, but also wanted to incorporate that technique of learning to make the resin figures. So, again, I'll just say I'm not an artist by any means, but I really enjoyed the process, and I am going to do more. I've already got the next one in mind, so stay tuned for that. I hope to start working on it soon. But I hope you enjoyed the process. So let me know if you have any thoughts on it, if there's anything you particularly liked about it. I'd love to hear your comments. But again, I'm not claiming to be an artist. I know it's not perfect, but I really wanted to just recapture some of that childhood nostalgia that a lot of us have about those retro McDonald's restaurants from the 80s and 90s. So yeah, that's it about that. We're just kind of continuing the anniversary week celebrations over here on the channel. So I do currently have a giveaway running, so be sure to check out that previous video. The anniversary video has all of the details on that. Basically, once we hit 5,000 subscribers, I'm going to go ahead and draw that. So if you're watching this before then, make sure you go enter on that video. If you haven't subscribed yet, though, please do hit the subscribe button. It helps out the channel so much. But also, if you're on social media, please feel free to follow along on TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook. Just look up Pocket Vintage Toys and you will find me. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.